Welcome everyone to the Preschool Neuroscience Summit. Today I'm really excited to have Dr. Stuart Shanker with us. He's been someone that I've followed for many years in my own career. He runs the MEHRIT Centre and Self-Reg Global, which we'll have the links to, and he's very kindly provided you with some blogs and some information on understanding stress behavior for parents. Dr. Shanker is a research professor of philosophy and psychology and the CEO of the MEHRIT Centre and the scientific director of Self-Reg Global. He's written many books. His most recent one, Reframed, Self-Reg for a Just Society, came out in April this year. And he also has written Self-Reg, How to Help Your Child and You Break the Cycle of Stress and Successfully Engage with Life, both which have had great reviews and things. And he's just, an expert that consults with schools and organizations globally about this issue, and especially about excessive stress on child development and behavior, the impact of that. He has a 5-step model, which I'm sure he's going to tell us about in the talk today. So welcome, Stuart, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Helen.
Thanks. So we have lots of people from different backgrounds on the summit. Some are experienced early years teachers, some are new to the field, and we have lots of parents and counselors as well. So maybe you can just explain, first of all, what self-regulation is for people who might not know.
It's actually the perfect place to begin, and it's a difficult place to begin. And the reason is that there are an awful lot of different definitions of self-regulation that are circulating on the web or in the literature. And in fact, we did a study on this and identified 447 different definitions of self-regulation. I won't go into the details of what they all are, but in really basic terms, they're all variation. 446 of them are variations on self-control. That self-regulation is some form of controlling your emotions and thoughts. Wow. But that's not the way the term was originally used. So I was trained in self-regulation in Oxford, and the definition we used was the original definition, the one that was self-regulation as a concept was introduced at the beginning of the 20th century by an American, a man called Walter Bradford Cannon, and he was a physiologist. And when he talked about self-regulation, he used it to mean how we manage stress. And this is a very, very important point. It's the way we use self-regulation in our institute or in my model. And one of the most important aspects of his original definition is it enables us to distinguish between what we call maladaptive self-regulation and growth-promoting self-regulation. So let me just briefly explain what's going on here. All children self-regulate. They self-regulate really from the moment of birth. At the moment of birth, they have been inside in the womb, they have been in a relatively stress-free, or at least a stress-reduced environment. There's not much noise, there's not much light, they don't have to breathe, they don't have to worry about eating, digestion, elimination. All of these things are done for them. And at the moment of birth, at the moment of parturition, the newborn is assaulted by an extraordinary range of stresses. And this is stress in the original meaning of the word. Stress is anything that requires us to burn energy in order to maintain some sort of balance. So for example, I have to maintain an internal body temperature of 37 degrees. And cold or cold weather is a stress. In fact, it was the original example that Cannon gave of stress. And so the brain triggers things like shivering to generate heat in order to maintain that internal body temperature of 37. But shivering burns, those are micromuscular movements. They generate heat as a byproduct. Any stress, by definition, is something that causes us to burn energy in order to stay in some sort of a range. The reason why this is such a beautiful definition is it enables us to see that some kids cope with some babies cope with this sudden onslaught of stress in ways that are actually maladaptive. And by maladaptive, what we mean is that it may reduce the stress in the moment, but it creates even greater stress down the road. Would you like me to give you an example of that, Helen? Or
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
all right, well, let's take a little kid that's on the spectrum. And so we ran a research institute where we were studying, both as psychologists and neuroscientists, we were studying children on young infants on the spectrum. And we were convinced that you could identify a child at risk of autism at a very, very young age. And in fact, a study came out while we were working by Lonnie Zwagenbaum showing that we can, in fact, identify children at risk by around 10 months. And that's what we were seeing ourselves. The problem for that child, for that baby, is the following. This is a baby that, for neurogenetic reasons, finds certain kinds of experiences extremely stressful. So, for example, social interaction with their caregiver is a very stressful experience. And it has to do with a number of senses. The proximity of another person, the intensity of shared gaze, sounds, even touch. And so what the baby does, or a great many of them, is let's take as one example, they gaze avert. So gaze aversion is not some sort of innate malfunction. What it is it's a maladaptive way of dealing with stress. What the child is doing is avoiding the intensity of shared gaze as a way of coping with that stress. Well, why do we say it's maladaptive? It's maladaptive because we know that a great deal of learning occurs in these face-to-face interactions. Language, the meaning of emotions, tones of voice, gestures, all of this is going on in these face-to-face interactions. By gaze averting, the child is blocking one of the primary modes of learning. If we go a couple of years later, what we find is a great many of the children on the spectrum have severe deficits in language, we'll say. Problems in language, or problems in understanding emotions, or in mind reading. So here's a case where their way of dealing with the stress in the early years of life was actually creating far more stress down the road. Now, what we studied very carefully was, how can you deal with, how can you help this child? You can't force them. You can't force them to look at you in the eye. This has been tried. You can't put a funny put a funny nose on, or put something on your head and try to seduce them into looking at you. They have to want to naturally look at you. And what we did in our studies was we figured out what were the stresses that we could reduce in order to enable that child to naturally engage in these interactions. And it turns out that was, in fact, the birth of Self-Reg as a model. So that's what we're doing, not just with young children, but with all children, teens, trying to figure out, why is this kid overstressed? Why is this teen overstressed? What can I do to reduce the stresses so that the child can engage in a growth promoting way with stresses that really are beneficial, either for the body, like weightlifting or exercise, or for the mind, like school.
Really, really interesting how this happens so young as well, and you
Yes,
can identify it in such
yes.
young children. That's really interesting. So what is exactly happening in our brain and our bodies when we self-regulate or when we don't self-regulate?
Okay, so we'll change that question. Okay, so what's happening in our brains and bodies when we have a maladaptive way of self-regulating? What's happening when we have a
Yeah.
growth promoting?
Yeah.
So when it's maladaptive, let's take an example that everyone can relate to. A lot of children today are dealing with stress. For example, the stress of the pandemic with electronics. So video games or social media, or so we can actually see what's going on inside their brain while they're engaged in these activities. In fact, there's a book coming out very shortly by a Vancouver psychiatrist, which explains in vivid detail what's going on inside the brain. So what's going on is that the child, let's take the video game example. So here you've got the kid who's dealing with their stress by playing some game over and over and over. And every parent, every caregiver knows that the second you force that child to turn off the machine, you're going to have a mess on your hands. I've yet to see the kid who, having spent 6 hours on this, happily turns off the game and goes and helps mom.
Right.
Okay. So we want to, so your question is, well, why is that happening? What's going on here? And what's going on is that inside the brain, the child is being driven by some neurohormone, which is called dopamine. And the dopamine keeps the kid hooked, keeps the kid playing level after level of what is absolutely a nonsensical activity anyways. But dopamine is it's a very powerful hormone. It was developed, we believe, for hunting. It kept us glued to the hunt. Dopamine has a very nice kind of side effect. It gives you this feeling of being slightly energized. Okay, so here's what's going on then. We've got this system that is dealing with stress by creating its own stress. The game is in fact a stress, it's burning energy. So what's going on that we have to worry about? Well, while the child is burning, while the child is in, and we have a very technical term for this, it's called being in an ergotropic state. And what that means in English is that there are sort of restorative neurohormones, a restorative system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which shuts down. So while the child is engaged in this, mindless, playing the game, there is no digestion is slowed, cellular repair is slowed. All of the processes, the internal processes that rebuild energy are put on hold. So when you finally turn off the game, what's happened is that now the child is in a very, very depleted state. In fact, we have a graph that we use, and you can get a copy of that for your members, Helen,
Yeah.
for free.
Okay.
And if you look at that chart, it's called a Thayer matrix. The child is deep in the bottom right, where tension is very high and energy is rock bottom. So that's the negative one. That's what's happening when it's maladaptive. Now, what happens when it's growth promoting? So let's take a really great example. One of the most beneficial growth promoting modes of self-regulation for a kid is reading. So what happens with reading is the exact opposite. Now, when they finish the reading, the tension has come way down and the energy has gone way up. And that's what we're looking for in trying to shift kids from maladaptive to growth promoting modes. getting them engaged in activities where they have more energy at the end than they had when they started.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So we know that this kind of work is obviously so important in preschools and kindergartens, caregivers of young children. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how it might affect a child's behavior, and then what we might look at doing to promote the growth side of that?
In a way, what you've just asked is the single most important question I think that we can ask about early childhood educators. What we have come to realize is that of all educators, they are actually the most important.
Right.
So it's not a case of just having that warm, nurturing figure who provides affection for the child. In fact, a lot of our work is helping educators, or educating educators and caregivers, to recognize when a child is adopting maladaptive patterns, figure out why, and then figure out how to shift it. Now here, I'll tell you something very interesting. We study something like IQ, and everybody knows what IQ is. So we study, and this is explained in great detail, carefully, I think, in my new book, in Reframe. So we study IQ very, very, very carefully. And psychologists made a very important discovery. IQ changes quite dramatically up until around the age of 10. At the age of 10, it now stabilizes. So you can make predictions, quite strong predictions, about what a child's IQ will be at the age of 60 based on what their IQ was at the age of 10. But you can't make that same prediction when you measure the child's IQ at the age of 5. IQ itself is it becomes stabilized. It becomes what we call entrenched. So what we want to know is what's going on in those first 10 years. When a child's intelligence is really being formed. And, it's a kind of a technical issue here, but basically what's happening is there is a system in the brain, deep inside the brain. It's a system that acts without our knowing it, we don't control it. It acts on its own. It's a mechanical system. And one of the things it's designed for is when the blood sugar drops below a certain level, this system kicks in and it stops us. Imagine it's like a toilet float. So when the float goes below a certain level, it stops the system. The question then is, what is it monitoring, and why is this happening? Well, what it's monitoring is how much energy. For human beings, we're looking at glucose. We run on glucose. That's what we are. We're little glucose machines. Our brain runs on glucose. So it's monitoring the level of glucose in the bloodstream. And the glucose gets used on stress. Remember, that's where I started today. Now, there are all different kinds of stresses. So as a parent or as a teacher, you're looking at 5 different kinds of stress. You're looking at physical stresses, the stress of noise, the stress of crowding, the stress of uncomfortable chairs. You're looking at emotional stress, and that's an easy one, right? The stress of being angry, the stress of being overexcited. You're looking at social stress, the stress of getting along with other kids, of negotiating back and forth. You're looking at pro-social stress, the stress of what kind of person you are, what you want to be. And you're looking at something called cognitive stress. And cognitive stress is a difficult concept But basically, just think math. Math is the best
Okay.
example there is of a cognitive stress, and it's a cognitive stress for lots of reasons. For some kids, it's more stress than for others. And that means that um, in math class, they are burning more energy than, say, the little kid sitting beside them. Now, remember what I said about the toilet float. The kid is burning so much energy trying to do math that maybe the kid beside him can do easily, that his limbic system stops him. It breaks. We call them limbic brakes, like the brakes on a car. There are all kinds of ways in Self-Reg. So we have that 5-step method you mentioned. So there's all kinds of ways to figure out why the limbic brakes are kicking in for this kid, what we can do to reduce the stress so that he can or she can not just do math well, but enjoy the experience. But if we don't, here's what happens. So we don't recognize that his brakes have kicked in. Here's what happens. Pretty soon, he develops a maladaptive mode of self-regulation. He won't even try to do math. You pull out the math book and he misbehaves, so he gets kicked out of class. He figures out some way of avoiding it. That's very maladaptive. He needs to do well in math. And that pattern becomes entrenched around the age of 10. So if I can get to that kid when he's young, if I can get to that kid in kindergarten or in grade 1, and I see that this is actually a stress behavior, and I can figure out why, and we can teach you, the reasons why it's happening in the case of math, and we can actually give the child exercises that will reduce that stress. And the exercises are fun. They've created games, they've created all kinds of really neat ways of reducing the cognitive stress. But only someone who's trained in this, only someone who's working with young children, who understands this difference, who understands what limbic braking is, that's the person who can intervene at this point. Now, I come back to what I said about why this is the most important of all the professions.
Yeah.
You're setting that child's trajectory. You have a chance here that when that kid hits 10, that kid is locked into growth promoting modes of self-regulation. That's the kid who's going to do really well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's great to hear that validation of the importance of early childhood educators, for sure. So, Stuart, tell us a little bit about relationships we know are very important in developing self-reg. So what are some of the key kind of mistakes that people might make, or key areas that we should focus on, whether it's as a parent or an early childhood practitioner?
Well, the single biggest mistake is trying to manage the child's behavior. That's the single biggest mistake. And I say it's a mistake because the whole goal of self-reg is not to manage behavior, it's to understand behavior. Now, I give you a little bit of science here, okay?
Yes.
I mentioned, how the newborn is really assaulted by all these new stresses that it didn't have inside the womb. But here's another piece of the science that's very interesting. We now believe that the newborn is still a fetus. In fact, we refer to the newborn as a fetus outside the womb for around 4 to 6 months. And there are various reasons why this happened, but basically it's to allow for an explosion of brain growth immediately after the point of birth. At the point of birth, the brain starts creating 700 new synapses every single second. So the theory is that nature wanted us to have these huge brains that we have, and the thinking part of our brain, which is what's exploding after birth, we couldn't develop it in utero because then it would be impossible to actually pass through the birth canal. In fact, the size of the modern human cervix is the same size as the size of the cervix 10 million years ago. What's changed, however, is, of course, the enormous size of our brains compared to the size of the brain of the earliest hominids. And that growth, that huge growth in the human brain, modern human brain, occurs outside the womb. So this is a very interesting, this is, well, more than interesting, this is a very important discovery. And it raises for us a fundamental question. If this newborn is still a fetus outside the womb, so you have an internal fetus, external fetus, if that's the case, what takes the place of the umbilical cord? And the answer is what we call the interbrain. Now, the interbrain, there's been many scientists that have been studying this for the last 70 years, I'd say. The interbrain, the term was coined by an English psychologist called Digby Tantum. And the idea is there is a brain-to-brain hookup from the primary caregiver's brain to the infant's brain. It's a wireless hookup. It's like a Bluetooth from her brain to the baby's brain. We can go even a little bit more specific. We've now, we use a model of the brain where we distinguish between the thinking part of the brain, which in Self-Reg we call the blue brain. That's the part of the brain you use to speak, to solve problems, to know what someone else is thinking, to know what you are feeling. And the systems deep inside the brain, under the surface, called the limbic system. The hookup, the interbrain hookup, is literally from limbic to limbic. It's a limbic to limbic hookup. It's so strong that the caregiver, so think back to, if you've had children, think back to your own experience. You don't just see that your baby is uncomfortable, you feel that your baby's uncomfortable. So this is a very powerful mechanism, hooking up an experienced brain that knows for example, it feels or you see that your baby is cold, you know that you have to put a blanket on the baby. You see that your baby has the signs of being hot, you know that you have to remove the blanket. The baby can't do that for itself, it's just a fetus. So this interbrain is absolutely huge. Through the interbrain, the higher order brain regulates the lower order brain. And it's by being regulated that those self-regulating systems develop and the child can eventually regulate herself. But now we've made a very interesting discovery. The interbrain remains incredibly strong, the primary mechanism actually for dealing with stress, for around the first 70 to 80 years of life.
Wow.
So we always need the interbrain. In fact, in work we do with the elderly, what we find is if we can reestablish, if we have an elderly person who is isolated, solitary, if we can reestablish interbrain connections, not just does their mood improve, but their health indices, their blood pressure, their heart rate, everything improves as a result of the interbrain. So the child is moving from one kind of interbrain, namely caregiver, to another interbrain, namely early educator or caregiver. Okay, so I said we made a very important discovery, and we did. In our in our clinic, we were having children referred to us, and on their clinical notes it said has an attachment disorder.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't know if I can assume for all your members that they'll know what attachment disorders are.
Yeah, I think most people would have
Okay.
an idea.
Okay, so here we had this notification from someone who had observed the kid saying that the kid had an attachment disorder. But when we watched the child with mom or dad or whoever is the primary caregiver, we did not see an attachment disorder. We saw warm, strong attachment. And we realized that there is a further fundamental distinction to be drawn here between robust secure attachment and fragile secure attachment. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, let's take robust secure attachment. That means, in essence, that the child can shift, can move from one interbrain, its primary caregiver, to, say, an early educator, and remain organized, remain securely attached with this new interbrain. And as an early educator, so you'll know what this feels like. You know that this kid that you have, that the kid feels safe in your presence. But the case of the fragile secure attachment is quite different. So these are typically kids that have all kinds or some sensory issues. So maybe they have a sensory threshold in one sensory modality that's very high, or in another that's very low. But the caregiver, the primary caregivers, have learned or have been helped, and they know how to adjust their interactions with the child to maximize that interaction, to get that, what we call it synchrony, to get the synchrony cooking. And that's the definition of secure attachment, right? That you get this great goodness of fit. But to give you a very simple example of a child that we worked with, so we had a kid come in, and this was a child that was around 2.5, getting on to 3, had just been introduced to a daycare and was having all kinds of problems, meltdowns, etc. And so now, you become a stress detective. What's going on? Was it just separation anxiety? Was it something going on in the daycare that was overloading the child? We had to figure out what was the cause of all this. Was the child simply too young? And so we had a team, and the team began investigating, and they came up with the answer, and it was one of those answers that just blew everybody away. Mom had, without realizing it, she had shifted to using scentless soap and no scented cleaning agents in her apartment. The child had a very, very sensitive olfactory system, and scents, a strong scent, sent the child into stress overload. The early caregiver wore perfume. The perfume was sending this little kid into stress overload. Now, in cases, so that's a great example of how the child was securely attached to mom, but insecurely attached to the daycare provider. Now, when we look at fragile secure attachment, what we find is the child is securely attached in the home because the parents have either consciously or intuitively adjusted their caregiving to the child's strengths and weaknesses. And if you question them, they can actually articulate things that they had unconsciously done. So they knew, for example, to lower their voice, or they knew not to have too many people in the apartment, or whatever. But the caregiver or the early educator did not have that knowledge. did not have that experience. And I mentioned to you, the question was, single biggest mistakes. So um, I said to you, managing behavior, but that idea is based on a critical distinction that is not drawn, and that's between misbehavior and stress behavior. So misbehavior, you want to manage. If a child's misbehaving, you really want to you want to teach the child the consequences of that choice. It's a bad choice. But stress behavior is caused. It's coming from this system deep inside the brain. So with stress behavior, what we have to recognize, what are the signs of stress behavior? And we teach that. So, it could be tone of voice, it could be facial, the color of their facial skin, it could be pupils. If you learn, you can spot stress behavior just by pupil dilation. There are many different, the tone of voice is a very good one to go by. And with stress behavior, you want to soothe. With misbehavior, you're going to punish or reward, whatever. But if you punish or reward stress behavior, you make it worse. So what do? What we do is we get mom and dad to work with the early educator, sharing with them the things that they've learned about the child's stress thresholds. The early educators meeting this kid, out of nowhere. What do you know? So there has to be this partnership where parents can share the things that keep the kid regulated. What we have found when we work with early educators in Self-Reg, when they take them through the Self-Reg Foundations course, is that the fragile secure attachment develops a secure attachment with them, with the early educator. And that's critical. It's that secure attachment that makes learning possible. That's a long answer, sorry, but it's a good answer.
No, it's really important, I think. I know we see lots of treating of misbehavior in different ways, and so it's really important to distinguish between those two things and find out what's really happening. Yep. So, Stuart, we're in a weird time in the world. In the middle of this pandemic, there's a lot of people who are stressed and feeling anxious. So how can we help children in times like this, and how do our own stress responses as adults affect the children that we're working with or parenting?
So again, you've asked a very, very good question. And there are layers to the answer. Let's go back to what I was talking about a second ago. I was talking about the interbrain and this limbic brain to limbic brain connection. So we don't actually, we can't really control our own limbic system. It sends out messages without our even knowing that we're sending them. And there is this phenomenon called limbic contagion. And what it means is, if I am hyper aroused, if I am very anxious, or I am angry, my limbic system will communicate that to a child. So I can be saying all the right words. I can memorize, and have a script of what I'm supposed to tell the child. But while I'm talking, my limbic system is also communicating. It communicates what it's feeling independent of my will, independent of my awareness. So let's say I'm very irritated with a child. That irritation that I'm feeling leaks, and that's the term used. It's leaking. It leaks out. This is my limbic system communication. It leaks out in my tone of voice, in my eye gaze, in my pupils. It's leaking, it's sending off these messages. So regardless of what I'm saying, so I could be saying, no, I'm not angry, I'm just trying to help you. But my limbic system is saying, you are really upsetting me. The problem with kids is that they only really process what your limbic system is saying. So you can have all the words right, you can be saying all the right things, but if your limbic system is sending out messages of irritation, that is what the child will hear. If you're angry, the child will become threatened. The problem that we have in the pandemic, a problem, is the stress load on parents is extraordinary. So you've got all of the stresses of your own personal life, whether it's job or food or whatever. You've got, if you're working, you've got the stresses of employment. You've got the stresses that you're absorbing as you make the mistake that I make every single day of reading the morning papers from the US. And in England, I know, Helen, you're in England now, and I'm not sure the Prime Minister has done that much better. And you've got all the stresses of your child. And if you are overstressed, and I think it pretty much goes without saying that we're all overstressed. There's a very interesting article over here yesterday that Michelle Obama has reported that she's suffering from a mild depression.
Oh,
wow. From which she believes is, pandemic caused. But there have been studies coming out saying, I'm not sure about the depression side, but there have been studies coming out saying that we are, as a species, suffering from anxiety disorders. We are, and if we have all this anxiety, and I know that I have it. Just last night, I have an 18-year-old son who wanted to go to a car meet this weekend, and I had an instant surge of anxiety. And I kind of broke all my own rules of self-reg, and the conversation with my son went nowhere because I was too anxious and he shut down, and I had to do self-reg in order to get that communication going. And that leads me to what I want to say here. The stress, okay, so we've got our own stress, which is very high. And then we've got the stress that the kid is suffering. And the stress on children is very, very high. And depending on their age, children's mechanisms for dealing with stress change as they grow. Up until around the age of 8, we as parents are their first mechanism for dealing with stress. And then when they go through what's called a second brain explosion, they begin to turn to peers, to friends, for dealing with stress. What we find, interestingly, is that social media, in this case, seems to be playing a very important role in helping them deal with the stress. But the problem here is the following. When we teach, so we do this like a summer symposium every year, and the very first day of the symposium, or we do learning institutes with educators, and the first day of those institutes is always this: self-regulation starts with self. So what we have to recognize is that my limbic system will be sending out what I am feeling. So if I can get calm, my limbic system will send out calm. In fact, we have a saying that calm begets calm. When we do self-reg, so self-reg, we start off and we do the 5 steps of self-reg, and I'll tell you very briefly what they are. You have to do them for yourself. You start with your own self-regulation needs. You start with your own, are you using maladaptive ways of self-regulating? So, for example, I've caught myself for the very first time in years suddenly eating a very rich Kawartha Dairy. If you know Kawartha Dairy, they make a wonderful ice cream, pralines and cream. Really, it's maladaptive because it's I found like the very first night I had it, it was just a teaspoon. Now I'm up to 2 bowls. So I think I'm thinking I better remember the stuff I teach. So the first thing we do in Self-Reg is we reframe. That means, we've done a very simple example, reframing a child's behavior. Is it misbehavior or is it stress behavior? But I have to reframe my own behavior. I have to recognize that if, for example, I'm finding it very difficult to fall asleep, or I'm waking up in the middle of the night and finding it difficult to get back to sleep, I have to reframe that. I have to see it's telling me that I am in a very high tension, low energy state. That it's building and building, and I'm not restoring properly, and that's why I'm having bad sleep. So I can go ahead. I can take sleeping pills. I can, I can drink alcohol. Both of those are maladaptive ways of dealing. I mean, maybe there are. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to argue that there aren't occasions, especially in depression, where it is necessary to have medication to repair a broken sleep cycle. But really in Self-Reg, what I want to know is, why am I overstressed? What are the stresses that I can reduce? So to give you a very, very practical example, I realized the other day that I was overdoing it with the ice cream. And I knew that that was maladaptive. So I wanted to say, okay, what are the stresses that I can reduce? I can't ignore the pandemic. That is a fact. But then I realized, I'm starting off my morning. Every morning I do the same thing. I start off, I read CNN, then I read the Washington Post, then I read the New York Times, Politico, and Axios. Well, you know, by the time I've had my dose of what Trump has done in the last 24 hours, I'm fit to be tied. So what I did was, the last couple of days, I simply stopped reading them. And guess what? I find that my mood, even right now, it's just, I have way more energy. So what we talk about in Self-Reg is step 2 is identify the stresses. So here's a stress that I identified, the stress of Donald Trump. And then step 3 is reduce the stress. And I was able to reduce the stress by just eliminating something that was in fact overstressing me. Now I just read the Globe. Step 4 is the pivotal step in Self-Reg. Step 4 is we call it reflect. And there are in fact 5 steps of reflecting. And I just wrote a blog about this that you can download for free, unpacking. But basically what we are seeing is a generation of children and teens that do not know what calmness feels like. So I have to help them experience calm. But remember what I said, calm begets calm. I can't help them experience calm if I am not calm. I can't tell them in an agitated voice, you need to calm down. Right? So, and you don't need the words calm. But we need them to be able to identify what it feels like, not just to be calm, but what it feels like when they are becoming overstressed. And the emphasis there is on becoming. And that leads me to step 5. Step 5 is called restore. And if we have a single message for anyone doing Self-Reg, is you restore before. And what that means is the following. When we study arousal, what we see is it looks like an inverted V. there's a sort of apex. And once you hit that apex, you crash. And so there are various ways you can crash. If you're dealing with young kids, that's when you get the meltdown or the tantrum or the explosive behavior, whatever. And the time for them to restore was before they hit that peak, before they hit that apex. And it's the same for ourselves. So what we need to do is we need to identify not just what calmness feels like, but also what being overstressed feels like. And what we find is with little kids, we can, by the way, you can teach this, you can help a little kid learn this around the age of 3. So that surprises people. But the language that you use is the language commensurate with the child's level. So with a 3-year-old, we will talk about, what do you feel in your tummy? What do you feel in your arms? We use visuals. We use a Raggedy Ann doll and then a Buzz Lightyear doll. Do you feel like Buzz? Do you feel like Raggedy Ann? We use spaghetti. Do you feel like this spaghetti uncooked or this spaghetti that's all visuals? To get them to identify the physical sensations. With older kids and teens, we now have to talk about, so with them, we will actually talk about the amygdala. And you can see on our website, we have videos by 8-year-olds talking about what their amygdala is doing when they're over aroused. The goal here is first we deal with our own self-regulated our own restorative needs. And the way each of us restores is infinitely variable. So I restore by so I've meditated for a long time. And my wife, well, all I need to tell you is that my wife was a stockbroker all her life. So need I say that my wife finds meditation very difficult? Okay, so so my wife meditates by swimming, and you can tell when she comes back from as our pools have just opened, our public pool just under strict guidelines. When she comes back, her whole face is relaxed. She's smiling. So each of us has to find what works for us. For some people, it's baking. For some people, it's knitting. Now, here's the most extraordinary thing I have learned so, we've done Self-Reg with, I don't know, tens of thousands of kids across Canada. And I am amazed at the different ways kids discover what works for them. But my favorite example was a behavioral modification class in the north of Canada, 12-year-olds, boys, really having a lot of trouble. And they had learned the best way for them to calm themselves was by knitting.
Oh, wow. Love it. That's
Yeah.
great.
So that's what we want to do is we want to help them find what works for them. There's no single strategy that's going to work for every kid. That kid has to find, but they can only find it if they know what calmness feels like.
Yeah. Wow. Great discussion there. And thank you for sharing all that. So just before we finish today, Stuart, I wanted to ask you what you hope to see kind of in the early education field in the years coming up. What kind of changes would you like to see, or what kind of things would you think are important to bring into teacher training or government regulation and things like that?
Okay, so there are two sides to that question connected. In a sort of practical way, I want to see them all doing, so we created a foundations course for early childhood educators, and I want to see them doing that. And I can tell you, so we run about, I've lost track now, maybe 8 different foundations courses, online courses. It's the ECD course, which is our most successful. It's the ECD course where we're constantly having to put on new cohorts. So that's a practical thing I'd like to see. But in a more sort of philosophical way, I want them to read my last book, my new book, Reframed. Reframed is an attack on determinist thinking. And what that means is nothing is fixed. Nothing is predetermined, not even temperament. So, we hear all the time that, a child is born with a certain temperament, or a child is born with a certain intelligence, and that determines what kind of personality they'll develop or how far they'll go in school. And what we've learned in the science over the in my generation, is that temperament itself is it is actually a manner of self-regulating. What we call temperament are modes of self-regulation. And the problematic temperaments are the result of being overstressed as an infant. The same thing applies to intelligence. When we start to work with a kid, figuring out what are this child's limbic brakes, what happens is the kid surprises himself and surprises us. The lesson here is we never, ever know what a child's potential might be. It's not that I can take any child and I can turn that child into an Einstein. The point is rather, I never know what a child's gifts are or what a child's potential is until I can release the brakes. When I do, I can make you one promise. The child will blow you away. Now, I think my final message for you is the result of an experience I had lecturing up in Yellowknife at the end of January a few years ago. The pilot came on and said it's minus 42. So that's cold. And they had to change my venue. I was supposed to be meeting at a school, and they changed it to the local theater. And I got into the theater, and it was standing room only, 2 tiers.
Wow.
Minus 42. So I was talking about Self-Reg, and at the very end, I said, I'm very curious about something. I said, either you don't notice that it's really, really cold out, or there's something going on here that I don't understand. Why are you all here? And there was a little voice from the second tier, from the upper balcony, who shouts down, it's because you give us hope. The greatest gift that an early educator can give to a child and that child's family is to give them hope. And that's what Self-Reg is all about.
Wow, wonderful. And I love your story at the end. Hope, yeah, such an important thing to have. So thank you so much, Stuart, for joining us, for sharing all that amazing research and information. I encourage everyone to have a look at the websites. We'll post the links. There's loads of information and videos and infographics and all kinds of stuff on there. And we'll have the links to Stuart's books as well, so you can check those out. I just want to say a big thank you for sharing this really important information with us today.
Okay, keep it up, Helen. It's important.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.